The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 27. Angels Ahoy. Summer in London could be pernickety. One day could be gloomy and chilly, and the next sweltering. Hermione was pleased, therefore, when July 16th dawned bright and sunny with just the slightest hint of a breeze. She'd planned to wear her favourite summer dress, a green and white pinstriped shirt dress with a full skirt. She felt sure Draco would like it. Draco and Narcissa arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. He wore a blue Muggle tuxedo and dragon-hide boots that someone had attempted to transfigure into Muggle trainers. Hermione's eyes widened, and she struggled to control her smile as she took in the red Nike swoosh that was upside down and looked more like a check mark. He'd clearly tried to recreate it from memory. Narcissa was startlingly dressed in her own unusual hodgepodge of attire. The tight white bell-bottomed trousers had tiny appliques of flowers and circular symbols that vaguely resembled peace signs. Her butterfly-patterned yellow shirt was topped by a brown suede fringed vest. She wore platform brown sandals to complete the look. "Oh!" said Linda in a small voice as she took in their garb. Oh. It's too much. Draco's outfit, it's too much, isn't it? I told him that this was for a formal evening event, not for a day visit." "Well, yes, it is a bit much. Also," Linda began, wringing her hands, how could you tell a friend that their wardrobe was hopelessly dated? "And I told you, Mother. Muggles don't wear that. Not now, anyway. Look at Hermione and Mrs. Granger." "Now, it's not so bad. Both of you look adorable, but yes, I think for today, perhaps a little change. Draco, would you mind terribly if we got you something from Richard's closet? Hermione, take Draco and show him Dad's clothes. Maybe just a simple collared shirt and some trousers." Next she turned to Narcissa. "And I must say I truly love this ensemble. It takes me back to my high school years. But Muggle fashion has changed a little." Linda took in the crestfallen expression on Narcissa's face. "Truly, Narcissa, you do have this fashion time period almost perfectly," Linda continued, smiling whilst eyeballing the faux peace signs a bit doubtfully. They looked more like a cross between a Mercedes and a Volkswagen symbol, if she was being honest. "I'm guessing the styles have changed a bit from the last time you spent time in Muggle London?" Narcissa smiled a bit sadly. "I used to go with my older sister, in the summers when we were at Hogwarts. Nymphadora's mother, I mean, not Bellatrix. Andromeda had a Muggle-born friend. She ended up marrying him, though at the time we had no idea they were dating. She was betrothed to Rabastan Lestrange. That's Bellatrix's brother-in-law." "Oh, Bellatrix is married?" "Yes. She married about a year after finishing school. We both did. It's the wizarding way." Linda nodded knowingly. She'd had a fair few conversations with Hermione about the differences between the magical and Muggle worlds often enough. Wizarding society, for all of its eccentricities and innovations, seemed a bit backwards in many ways. Narcissa nodded and sighed. "Well, if fashions really have changed that much, I guess I'd better too." She looked down a bit sadly. "Such a shame. I really liked these shoes." "Oh no, those shoes are mint. You're keeping those and also telling me where you got them. I love them," Linda gushed. "I'll do even better," Narcissa said, pointing her wand at the shoes. "Geminio!" 20 minutes later, Linda and Hermione ushered the newly restyled Malfoys into their station wagon and set off for the posh shops of Bond Street. It took quite a lot of insisting on the part of Linda and Hermione to convince Narcissa not to buy everything they stopped to look at. After a couple of hours, Linda managed to steer their group into a nearby restaurant. She held up a menu to speak quietly to Hermione. "This is nicer than the place your dad took me for our 15th wedding anniversary," she whispered. "A bit of a step up from Marks and Sparks and the Tally-Ho pub, isn't it?" Hermione murmured, to her mother's amusement. Whilst they waited for their first course, Draco and Hermione got up to walk around a bit, leaving their mothers in their matching shoes to chat. "I thought we might wander over to Hyde Park after this. The children can rent a pedal boat, and we can have a chance to meet with your niece privately," Linda said. "That sounds lovely." Narcissa smiled nervously. "Narcissa, can I ask you a question?" Linda asked. The other woman nodded. "What were you and my husband discussing the other night at your house, when I found you?" Narcissa took a deep breath. "The man that Hermione and Draco were speaking with the other night. That was he who shall not be named." Linda startled in sudden recognition of the phrase from the newspapers Hermione had delivered to the house. "You mean Lord Yes, but please don't say the name." "Why?" asked Linda, mystified. Narcissa gave a nervous smile as she met her friend's eyes. "Sorry, old habit. Years ago, the name was taboo. If you said it, he would show up." "Like Beetlejuice?" quipped Linda. Narcissa wrinkled her forehead in confusion. "Do you mean my great-great-uncle, Betelgeuse?" "No," Linda answered, thoroughly confused. "Oh, sorry. Betelgeuse is the name of a star? Is that what you meant?" "No, he's like an undead... You know what? Never mind. So the name was taboo?" "Correct. And for a long time, everyone in the wizarding world thought he was dead and gone, but he returned." "He returned? And he just happened to stop by and gatecrash your party?" Linda asked, with one eyebrow raised. Narcissa hesitated. "Not really. You see, several years ago, Lucius was swayed by the Dark Lord's ideals." "So he was like a Nazi?" Narcissa remembered hearing the word a time or two in her youth. She didn't know what it was precisely, but the connotations were frightening. "Someone who believes in blood supremacy," Linda supplied. "Yes," Narcissa whispered, her eyes downcast. Linda sucked in a breath. These were the wizards they had chosen to associate with. Or were all wizards this way? "And does Lucius still believe this? Do you?" "I do not. In truth, I never did believe in it. And I think that in recent years, Lucius may have changed his mind as well, at least to an extent. But he would be hesitant to voice this change of heart to the Dark Lord. Regardless of how your thoughts might change, once you have taken the oath, you are his." Narcissa took a long sip of her wine before she continued. "Many years ago, near the turn of the last century, that's when things started to change. Before then, wizards lived alongside Muggles somewhat peacefully. Yes, there were several well-publicized incidents, some attempts at burning and the like. It was unfortunate because the only people killed by those were Muggles, and actual witch or wizard cannot be burned. But several years on from the Enlightenment, things settled down. To be sure, there were a few dust-ups. A family might have to move or go underground when strange things would happen, and rumours turned against them. My father Cygnus had a Muggle-born grandmother. Of all of my family elders, she was always my favourite. In truth, most pure-blood families have a handful of Muggle-borns, or half-bloods, within them. We will have died out a long time ago if we'd kept marrying each other," Narcissa said with a little laugh. That explains a few things," Linda said thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" Narcissa asked. "Well, just the fashions, for instance. Our first time in King's Cross, we noticed a lot of Victorian-era clothing, even though many wizards and witches were dressed in more modern styles, and very few light bulbs. No telephones, only owls. No fountain pens or ballpoint pens. It's almost as though your society stopped adopting modern conveniences around 100 years ago." Narcissa nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right," she sighed. "But Lucius was more susceptible to pure-blood supremacy. His father, Abraxas, had been very fixated on blood status. Abraxas's mother died in childbirth, you see. His father, Olivier, was woefully underprepared to be a single father. He remarried almost immediately, this time to a Muggle-born witch. I believe the woman was wooed by the idea of a pitiful widower and his baby, and she thought that Olivier wanted more children." "But Olivier didn't," Linda guessed. Narcissa sighed. It turned out that Olivier had his heir, and did not want a spare. He merely wanted someone to keep his bed warm. Perhaps he didn't want more potential children because of their blood status, or perhaps it was just because he didn't see the need for more children. The second wife always resented Abraxas. I think she thought that if it hadn't been for him, she would have had a house full of children." Narcissa smiled mistily. It was a desire she was well acquainted with, the hope for more children. Linda nodded with a smile of her own understanding. So Abraxas hated Muggle-borns, and passed those thoughts on to Lucius. And Draco... Fear etched its way across her face. Did her daughter's boyfriend actually hate who she was? "No!" Narcissa reassured her quickly. "No, Draco has learned a better way of thinking. In no small part, I am sure, because of Hermione's presence in his life. I only wish that I had had his courage when I was his age." "Oh?" "Yes. Like I said, my daughter married a Muggle-born." Linda's eyes darkened. "Is that the reason you and your sister aren't close?" "Yes," Narcissa said, ashamed. "Andromeda was 2 years older than me. She was set to marry Rabistan right after she turned 19. She ran away and buried her husband a month before her 19th birthday. I was still 16, still in school, and I was terrified of losing the approval of my mother and father like she had. I know now that I should have stood up for Andromeda. She deserved better than her entire family abandoning her. But at the time, it seemed impossible." "It's all right," Linda reassured her. "I'm sure you have time to make up with her." "I can only hope you're right. But I know in Draco's heart he hasn't followed Lucius's ways." "Well, that's a relief to hear. So, Lucius was a follower of this guy. But then, why was he wanting to speak to Draco and Hermione?" "I don't know. I've asked Draco, and he said it was nothing. Have you spoken to Hermione about it?" "Well, until a minute ago, I didn't know there was anything to discuss. But you can be sure that we'll talk about it when they get back here." "Linda, you mustn't. Believe me, conversations about him are best conducted in private, if at all. If they have been told to do something and the Dark Lord finds out they told someone, We could all be in danger." Linda's eyes filled with quick tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, for now, our children are safe, and they're smart. If they need our help, they will ask." "You're willing to trust our children to go it alone against this Dark Lord bloke and come out unscathed?" Linda hissed incredulously. "I never said anything about going it alone. There is an organization working against him, and I have a feeling that my niece has a place within that organization. She's an Aura, which is the highest division of magical law enforcement in Britain. From what I have read in the papers, she's quite smart, and—" Here Narcissa hesitated. She had promised Richard that she would not reveal his part in any of this, but she never said anything about not revealing her own. "And I, too, have vowed my assistance with that same organization. I think that's what today's meeting is about. I believe Nymphadora wants my help in taking down the Dark Lord." "You mean our help?" Linda said, with a steely glint in her eye. Narcissa sucked in a quick breath. "Linda, I don't think it's such a good—" "Narcissa, if you think I'm allowing you and our 16-year-old children to fight this fight without me, you are gravely mistaken." "Hermione, what is this thing?" Draco asked. "It's a pedal boat. Wait, you know what a boat is, right?" "Don't be ridiculous, Granger." "All right, Malfoy. So, what's difficult to understand?" Draco cocked his head to the side. "Why don't we just use our wands to power it?" "Where's the fun in that? Besides, it's a Muggle boat." 10 minutes later, after several failed attempts at leaving the dock, followed by a couple of wonky circles in which they nearly clipped the moorings, the two of them had mostly managed to find a straight trajectory across the lake. "So, why do you think our mothers were so eager to get rid of us?" Hermione asked. "Probably discussing the names of future grandchildren," Draco offered, laughing a bit at her look of horror. "Come on, Hermione. My mother has been picturing little blonde curly-haired children since last year, at least." "Oh dear God," she moaned. "Do you really think that's it?" Draco stopped laughing and considered. "No, I think it's something more, but I don't know what. When we came upon your parents with my mother that evening at the manor, they all seemed so tense." "I can't imagine anyone not being tense after that night," Hermione said. "I mean, we literally ate dinner with Lord Voldemort." He took her hand, drawing it to his lips as he closed his eyes at the memory. He had not slept well at all since that night. "Who are they talking to?" Hermione asked suddenly. His eyes flew open. He scanned the bank, finally finding their mothers seated on a park bench, surrounded by ducks. Between them sat a stranger, a young woman with purple hair and a grey mini-dress. "I don't know," he said, befuddled. "Someone they just met, I suppose." "They seem to be having a serious discussion, to just strike up a conversation on a park bench with a stranger, don't you think?" "Do Muggles not usually do that?" "Not so often," Hermione answered. "And the fact that the woman is seated between them, something seems off. You don't recognize her?" "No. To be honest, with her purple hair, she doesn't look like anyone my mother would typically associate with," Draco said. "Nor mine, when it comes to that," Hermione laughed. The purple-haired woman gave Narcissa a quick hug. Hermione's mouth fell open. "Should we go over there? Make sure they're all right?" "What are we going to do? Ask them if they're being pickpocketed by the strange purple-haired lady?" Draco asked with a smirk. Just then, all three women turned to look at them. Draco and Hermione stared back. "Okay, yeah, that was weird," he murmured. "See what I mean?" The purple-haired woman stood and walked away. Draco and Hermione watched as their mothers leaned close to each other to talk, gazing intently at something in their laps. Hermione looked back towards the purple-haired woman, but was surprised to find that she was gone. "Where did she go?" Draco searched the walkers along the path, but couldn't find her either. Might have been a witch. She could have disapparated. For the rest of the afternoon, it stuck in Hermione's mind. In retrospect, it was obvious that her mum and Narcissa were trying to get rid of them for a bit. Was it only to meet this witch? And why had her mother met a strange witch out in public? What was going on? Tonks apparated into the out-of-order loo stall at the Nag's Head, near Hyde Park. The old pub was rather shabby, and almost always empty, owing to the abrasive personality of the owner and waitstaff. Locals barely tolerated him. He was held afloat by unsuspecting tourists. The broken toilet had been broken long before he purchased the place, and owing to the lack of customers, he never bothered to fix it. It was the nearest apparition point, used exclusively by magical folk. She took Kinnerton to Wilton, then made a left on Knightsbridge, enjoying the cool breeze and the warm sunshine as she walked. She smiled a bit to herself. It was on a day much like today that she had met Remus, at nearly the same place. She had been new to the Auror Corps, and as was typical, the lowest person in the ranks was assigned the Muggle liaison position with MI6. She took over from the previous Wix, Dawlish, who was glad to hand over the reins. A pureblood, Dawlish had little patience for Muggle bureaucracy, even the clandestine secret agent kind, and was happy to be well shot of it. She had been alerted to a possible terrorist bomb plot at Buckingham Palace, in which one of the participants was potentially a wizard. A stakeout was set up based around a potential planning meeting that was rumoured to take place in Hyde Park. Tonks was asked to meet an operative posing as a groundskeeper in the park. They were to roam a small part of the park together, using hidden comms to report back to the surveillance van parked a few blocks away. The stakeout was long and tedious, and after the third day of checking the same waste bins, meticulously cleaning the same flower beds, and pruning already pruned trees, the two of them were quite bored. They had already talked over their common interests: books, films, basketball. Perhaps it was proximity, but Tonks felt herself giggling too much, looking too long at the man. She needed to be careful, she reminded herself. It was bad enough, blurring the boundaries between work and personal life. Add in the boundaries between Muggle and magical, and she knew she should not start to develop a crush on this man. But it was a bit too late for that. She noticed she wasn't the only one who stared overly long, who let their hands brush unnecessarily, who smiled too wide. And then something he said ignited in her mind. "I went to a small boarding school in Scotland, not very well known, quite off the beaten path. Such a great place, so many good memories." "That's funny. I also went to a small boarding school in Scotland. It was pretty insular as well. Did you play sports there?" "I didn't, but my best friends played on our football team, so I often joined them at practices." Lobo looked up and caught her staring intently at him. "You all right?" "Were you going to say something different?" she asked, a bit too breathlessly. "Sorry?" "When you said football, were you about to say something different?" He shifted his eyes away cagily, and forced a laugh. "Why would you think that?" Tonks took a deep breath. She wasn't sure how to proceed, but she was almost certain that he had been about to say Quidditch. "My schoolhouse was called Hufflepuff," she said carefully and quietly. His eyes flashed to hers. "Hufflepuff?" "Yes," she whispered. He looked down at his empty hands, gripped around the handle of the groundskeeper's trolley. Suddenly, he lifted his hands and folded them together in front of him, as though he were trying to keep warm in spite of the sunny spring day. Then he opened his hands into a small, bold shape. Nestled inside was the tiniest bouquet of yellow tea roses, tied with a black and gold striped ribbon. He held the flowers out to her where she stood, frozen to the spot. "Merlin!" she whispered, sucking in a surprised breath. They had begun dating as soon as the stakeout had concluded, and Buckingham Palace had been deemed safe. Remus had had to disappear at intervals, and it wasn't long before she pieced together several things: the timing of his disappearances, the shredded clothes, the unreal amounts of fur in his flat despite him not owning a dog. He had tried to push her away several times, particularly after a bad full moon. "You don't want someone broken like me," he would tell her, even as she insisted she did. Even now, their relationship was tenuous at best. Most months he was able to get wolfsbane brewed by Professor Snape, but he still refused to let her in his flat during his transformation. He watched the calendar closer than an unmarried Catholic university girl, Tonks thought wryly. She shook her head to clear the thoughts of Remus and to focus on the task at hand. After crossing Carriage Drive, Tonks reached Hyde Park and approached a bench near the lake, finding Linda Granger waiting with a blonde woman that could only be her aunt. Narcissa Black Malfoy looked so much like the photos of her younger self that Tonks's mother kept in albums, she seemed to have barely aged a day in over 20 years. "Watcher? Linda? Mrs. Malfoy?"
"Nymphadora, please, call me Narcissa."
Tonks was surprised to see the sudden tears spring up in the older woman's eyes, and was even more surprised to feel them forming in her own eyes. "Narcissa, then. Ordinarily I go by Tonks, but my mother calls me Dora."
"You look like her,"
her aunt said quickly. Tonks laughed a bit. It was hard to imagine Andromeda Black Tonks with purple hair.
"Well, not your hair, of course, but I can see her in your eyes."
Tonks nodded. The two women, who had risen when she arrived, settled themselves on either side of her. "I've come today to talk to you about what we're doing, what we're trying to do to defeat you-know-who," Tonks began, primarily addressing Narcissa. "Let me stop you there, Dora," interrupted Linda from behind her. Tonks turned. "I'm going to be a part of this too. Anything I can do, I'm pledging my help with it now." "That's great," Tonks said. "And your husband's okay with you helping?" Behind her, Tonks felt a small nudge against her hip. She could almost feel a slight whisper, so ethereal she might have imagined it.
"She doesn't know about his involvement."
Linda had drawn herself up in quiet anger. "I don't need to run everything I do by my husband." "No, of course not. I didn't mean... Well, of course you don't. That's great. Then, now, how we'll communicate. Narcissa..." Tonks turned back to her aunt. "I've got you a mobile phone. I've programmed in my number, as well as the number for Kingsley. He's a good friend of mine, a senior Auror, well connected within the Order. He says he remembers you from Hogwarts." "Will you message me with Bosley's number as well?" Linda asked, removing her own mobile phone from her pocket and flipping it open to scroll through her contacts. Did you just say Bosley? Tonks smiled widely. Can we call ourselves the Angels?
Linda laughed. Slip of the tongue. My apologies. Who did you say? Tonks gave her Kingsley's number, then turned back to Narcissa.
You don't need to keep me apprised of everything that goes on. We have— she raised a knowing eyebrow— other sources that can give us some information. With Richard Granger in position as a supposed Death Eater, he had plenty of valuable intel that even Narcissa would not know. But if something escapes our sources' notice, if there's anything you think is important, pass it on to me and Linda. If I don't answer and it seems urgent, message Kingsley. Do you know how to send a text? I can show you,
Linda reassured her. Tonks leaned over to hug Narcissa briefly, then stood.
Linda, thanks for setting this up. It's been a long time coming.
Linda nodded warmly. Far too long. I would have loved for you and Draco to have had the chance to know each other growing up. After all, you are each other's only cousins.
Narcissa broke off, her eyes drifting to the lake where Tonks could tell that Draco and Hermione were trying not to gape openly at the three of them. Tonks shivered a bit to see exactly how much Draco looked like his father. She had had brief dealings with Lucius over the last couple of years she'd spent as an Auror, mostly in the halls of the Ministry. He had always acted as though he were better than everyone else around him. She only hoped that that attitude hadn't rubbed off on his son, her only cousin. But she'd heard that he'd helped Harry Potter and Hermione in the Ministry months before, so perhaps he took after his mother more. She turned back to the women to say goodbye. Well, Angels, she said. Linda giggled. I'll be in touch. And with that, she walked away, moving to a small copse of trees nearby and disapparating.
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.